first mix in this studio 10 years ago, I charged $175. Now it's 10 years later, I'm mixing over 100 projects a year and I'm charging dollars. Now, not only am I going to share the mistakes and the lessons I've learned, but I'm also going to detail, and this was a fun sort of little bit of data point I got, was how many mixes I mixed each year for the past 10 years. So as we go through each year, I'm going to share how many mixes I completed, and it's really telling of the supply and demand side of things and how that all balances out and works over time. Thanks, Ed Thorne, for mentioning, how does pricing play into that? All the information I'm going to share in this video, I'm also going to compile into a newsletter I'm going to put out next week, but it's going to be more detailed in the terms of the things that I feel I've talked about that people can take and use tangibly in their own careers. So if you want to join that newsletter, head down to the description. Now, year one, 2014, I'm charging $175 a mix. And this is how the invoice is itemized because I'm only charging for half days. Now, this is a flawed logic. This is the biggest mistake I made, was that when I opened this studio, I reverse engineered my projected revenue, or the revenue I wanted to make at the studio, at 100% fill rate. So I said, I'm going to fill the studio up 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year. And for each day, I need to earn $350 of revenue, which means each mix needs to be $175. That is perfect on paper as a theory, but in reality, you're never going to have 100% fill rate because you're just opening up the studio, and to achieve that, you need 500 mixes to do. Okay? I think would it be 500? It'd be 2 mixes a day, 10 mixes a week, 50 weeks, 500 mixes. Where the hell was I going to find 500 clients or 500 mixes to do in my first year of opening business? What I found was I was spending a lot of time nurturing the business because it just opened, the studio just opened, and fulfilling projects was sort of secondary. So I had lots of open, unpaid time for in the schedule, and the fees I was charging for a mix, $175 for half a day of mixing, weren't covering it. I didn't have revision costs inbuilt to those mixing rates. So I was even churning my mix rate down because I was spending extra time after the fact doing revisions. Not a good way to start. That was 2014, and I completed 2 mixes that year. Nonetheless, that wasn't a rate structure that would ever survive. It just couldn't. But I did stay to time-bound rate structures in terms of hourly, half a day, a whole day of mixing, whatever it might be. I stayed to time-bound mixing rates up until 2017. I've got it all noted here. 2014, $175 a mix, completed 2 mixes. 2015, $350 to $400 a mix, I completed 8 mixes. 2016, $350 to $400, I completed 12 mixes. And 2017, I completed 20 mixes for $350. I found that because they were of lower budget, they typically weren't working with experienced producers. They were self-producing or self-recording, and they were trying to navigate the technology themselves. And mixing was a gap or a skill set they didn't have. And what that meant was they were leaning on the mixing, and this is just sort of reminiscent of artists that I was working with at the time, and they're all super talented. So this isn't a dig at them. There was a big lean on the mixing to fill part of the production process, which they were missing out on. So that meant that my skill sets had to almost lean into a bit of a production style. Production isn't my strong suit, okay? So I struggled in those first few years meeting the satisfaction of those clients. The mixes sounded great, they agreed. The mix sounds good, but it's missing something. So I had to really explore in those formative years with different textures, with different tones, and hitting certain notes. That was one of the struggle points I had. One of the success points I had, though, was learning that production isn't one of my strong suits, mixing is, and if I could encourage my clients to explore the production in their own production mixes and then send those stems across in terms of explore your reverbs, don't be afraid to add effects and whatnot to your stems and send them over wet, I can embrace those creative directions and enhance them in mixing. So that's when I transitioned to sort of how I work now, where I request wet stems from clients because I want to take their vision and move it forward. And something that's pretty typical now, I'm finding with bigger projects I'm working on with more experienced producers with labels and whatnot, is what labels and what producers sign off on with the artist is typically what's getting handed over for mixing. I'm not getting dry stems sent to me. I'm getting wet stems sent to me. And that's really good because that production section is filled and I'm purely focusing on the mixing. Actually, I've got a note here. One of the biggest issues I had in that time happened in 2017, when this is something you should do, is go through all of the inquiries you've had and find out how many inquiries you haven't followed up on, or you've dropped out of communication with because they've just been lost in email. And when I went over my form inquiries from my website and stuff I didn't follow up on, it amounted to $14,000 of potential work I lost. $14,000. Okay, that's about 40 mixing projects at the rate I was charging it in that period. That is a big deal in terms of opportunity loss. The revenue is one thing, but the opportunity to connect with people and help them as an engineer and learn as an engineer, that was completely just in thin air, thrown out. So I got a CRM. I used HubSpot, and something I hated about it, not just HubSpot in general, I used HubSpot, Pipedrive, a few other like Salesforce and other CRMs I tried. They're just super high friction. I'm not a salesperson in the sense that I need to be tracking every, like what was the last meal the lead ate, where do they shop at, what's their grandmother's maiden name. Like the amount of information you can store on those CRMs are ridiculous, and it just made it so high friction for me. I hated having to keep it up to date. I did because I realized, shit, I lost a lot of opportunity by not having one, but I ended up using a CRM. I don't use those CRMs anymore. I don't use any CRMs. I use a different system to manage all my clients, and I'll talk about that later on. But that's one thing. How you manage your communications is important. CRM wasn't for me, even though I use it, and it does help me in the future years in terms of 2018 to 2020. But that was one thing I realized I was losing a lot of opportunity there because I wasn't following up people. I wasn't responding. Sometimes I just miss emails. I'll be like, yeah, I'll send you the mix next week. And they send me the mix and it's like buried in my emails and I never responded. Pretty embarrassing. Really embarrassing. Anyway, so like I said, 2014 to 2017, I'm focused on time-bound charging. Then from 2017 to 2020, or 2018 to 2020, sorry, I'm focused on project rates. But now I'll explain to you what I mean by project rates is. Project rates means that I'm not going to charge you by the hour or by the day. I'm going to focus on the result. Now, how we navigate getting to that result, I might place boundaries on in terms of we'll do an initial mix, we'll do a secondary mix, and then we'll get a couple revisions in, because that's how I did structure it for a long time. And what that meant was that I could take as long or as little time as I needed on any part of those stages. Actually, I could take 10 hours on an initial mix, or 1 hour on an initial mix, or 20 hours on a secondary mix, or 5 minutes on a secondary mix, as long as I was achieving the goals for my clients, which I thought was pretty good. And it was good, but the problem is that I was still charging close to what I was charging previously, which was $400 in 2018, $400 in 2019, $500 in 2020. I'll also let you know that in 2018, I completed 50 projects, 2019, 61 projects, 2020, 92 projects. Okay. So I'm completing a lot of projects, but I'm still charging pretty close to that $350 mark I was charging when I was doing time-bound charging. And the issue with that is, because I committed to the completion of a project based on these boundaries that weren't time, but more result-based, that some projects blew out my resources. And that isn't to the fault of the clients. The clients are perfectly within their right to request revisions or request, send over as many stems as they want or whatever it might be. But I ended up burning myself out because what was happening was some mixes I was spending 16 hours plus on, and the fee was $400 for the project. And you look at it and you go, that doesn't balance out. So that was something that I was like, okay, that's not the best way to operate. That period was sort of like the project-based stuff people enjoyed because we were bound, and that is also reflective in the amount of mixes I did. We were bound by results, not by time. And I think people enjoyed being bound by results because we were working towards something together rather than being bound by time, because I think when you're bound by time, there's a bit of a pressure there, both on the client and the engineer, to reach an end goal by that end of the time. Okay. So result-based, really good. My price structure was a little bit low for charging for results. Should have been a little bit higher. Something I realized though, which did help me, and this was a lesson I learned and something I understood, which I sort of capitalized on a little bit, not financially, but capitalized in the sense of engaging with the right clients, was that for mixing, if I'm going to be charging based on results and project desires or what people want to get out of mixing, it meant that I had to focus on the setup of each project. And the setup of each project, not in the DAW, but in terms of the conversation I had with clients. So that meant lots of phone calls, lots of meetings at the studio, and this is also contact time. I didn't factor into how much I was charging and I was not losing money on, but I was spending time on for no financial benefit other than landing projects, was 1 hour meetings where they'd come to the studio, and then you times that out by, 50 projects in 2018 or 92 projects in 2020. That's 100 hours of time that's just not paid for. Was basically sitting down and going through the mix and chatting it out and trying to find their direction, which I didn't really do in those first formative years. It was sort of like, I'm a mixing engineer, send it over, I'll send it back. And I think that hurt me as well. But understanding how to navigate a discussion with somebody and navigate a discussion with empathy, because how do I put it? When we hear a mix as a mixing engineer, our brain and our mind can creatively go to many directions. And that can be sometimes really cool and exciting, but sometimes it can be quite divergent and contrary to what the client or artist wants. So sitting down and sort of releasing myself of my expectations on what I had to bring to the project was really good, because often clients had very simple and easy needs to meet. And just by listening and understanding what they were, I was able to, take note of all those things and address them in the mix and end up with some very successful in terms of interactions and projects where everybody walked away happy. Whereas the previous years, I didn't have those conversations. So maybe that was a little bit of the jar that I had in terms of getting my foot in terms of getting the ball rolling for mixing. But I think the whole idea of charging for projects or charging for results over charging for time sort of calls for that. It sort of calls for you to go, well, if you're going to charge for results, what are the results you're promising? The result you promise isn't going to be what everybody wants, so you need to have a conversation with each person. That's what ended up happening there. Now we're going to fast forward to 2021, okay, to 2024. And this is where my project rates started to really align with the project and result services I was providing, in terms of there was an equilibrium there. The rates allowed me enough time, resources, and energy to put into each project, and everything was fairly compensated. Finally, though, so remember 2020, I said I completed 92 mixes. 2021, I only completed 40 mixes. It was a big dip from 2020 to 2021, but my rate went up. So I went from $500 a mix to $700 a mix in 21. So instead of completing 92 projects like I did in 2020, I completed 40 in 2021. And I think that was because the rate jump was so high. The benefit, and I sort of knew that was going to happen when I did that rate jump, was that the people who were staying on board to mix with me or engaging me to mix at that rate were much more engaged in the project. They were less blasé about the money they were spending and very careful and focused on making sure that the project was knocked out of the park. Like the stems were coming across properly formatted, properly named. I wasn't getting stems missing. It was a good sort of level up to do. That meant I had bigger expectations on me because there was a bit more of a rate being introduced, but I didn't mind because it was a really good compromise in terms of rate raise and effort I could put in, fairly compensated, I believe. Now, 2022, again, it was 46 mixes. So in 2 years, 2021, 2022, I did less mixes than I did for all of 2020. Okay, I was still at a $700 rate. I did move up a little bit, 46 mixes, and then I kept pushing, and I'm not sure why it sort of blew out. I think it might have just been sort of like a snowball effect in terms of other people hearing about the mixes, hearing my mixing, seeing me sort of like my credits build up on my Instagram because I share all my mixes that I do on there and all the projects I'm working on. 2023, you're not going to believe, last year, over 100 mixes. That's pretty crazy. Still at that $700 rate. That was at the start of that year. Actually, at the start of 2023, I was on holiday in Phillip Island. It was early on in the year. Now, I actually remember this. This is a really interesting story. This was probably the best thing I did in terms of meeting demand, because that's a big amount of mixing projects to have. And again, you're going to remember, in context of all this, mixing isn't my main thing. Mastering is. I love mixing records, don't get me wrong, but my mastering business is sort of like the heart and crux and soul of this place. Mixing is a super fun passion I get to enjoy by the pure chance of people wanting me to mix for them. Now, that's right, I was on holiday in Phillip Island, and I realized, I sort of saw the year ahead, like by inquiries, and I go, this is going to be a busy year. I'm not going to have enough time to satisfy all this unless I get an assistant. So that was probably the next best thing I did for onboarding projects, so I didn't have stress. I didn't want to spend time bringing stems in, importing them, organizing them, cleaning them up, doing all that stuff. I just sort of wanted to get to my desk and mix. Again, my rate is $700 at that time, and it's a pretty decent rate. Now, I hired 5 assistants, okay, to work on the same project for me while I was away. Okay, so I was going on a holiday, and I go, you know what the best test will be is if I get 5 people that I trust, that I know behind the scenes, asked a few peers as well who they recommend, to all prepare a project for me. It's going to be the same project. I'm going to give them step-by-step guide on how to do it, and I'm going to go on holiday. And whoever doesn't contact me and does the job right, awesome. And it did work out. One of the people out of the 5 did not contact me, got the project done, off to the races. That was Ethan Horning. You can check him out on Instagram. He's still assisting for me till this day. And that was probably one of the best blessings ever. Now, with that said, something I'm realizing with onboarding sessions as I'm getting more and more sessions, I'll talk about 2024, because 2024, I put my rate up again. So $700 isn't my final rate. At the moment, I'll tell you in a second when I tell you how many projects I've already went through this year. But anyway, one of my biggest weaknesses I'm finding with having this many projects on board is that I've sort of went back a step in the onboarding with stems, because when things are a little bit more controlled, I'm doing about 40, 45 mixes a year. That's 2021, 22. If stems didn't come across correctly, I had the time, I had the leniency to sort of like liaise with the client, jump on a call, show them through it, help them out to get that all together. I don't really have that luxury to do it, every week at the moment, or twice a week, to help clients get things across. It's so happening that every now and then the stems don't come across properly, and I'm thinking the solution to this is simply purchasing Ableton and Logic, because that will sort of cover my bases between Pro Tools, Ableton and Logic, and maybe even FL Studio. Whatever doors I need to have, I'm going to just buy them, and then having my clients freeze their tracks in there, and then having those sessions across to my assistant. They can go into the native DAW, export the stems as I need them, and then re-import them into my mixing session. Because that's what I'm finding is probably like one of the friction points I'm having at the moment. Anyway, I said I was going to hold off on my actual rate, which I am at the moment, and that is $800 is my nominal rate. Now, that fluctuates. Like all my prices have always fluctuated based on the size of the project. So if I got 20 tracks coming in, it's not $800 a track. It's more around 600. If I've got, a large 16-minute multi passaged orchestral arrangement with 150 stems, well, it's might be a little bit dearer, but ultimately it's project-based fees. So one of the things I've learned is that probably the two key things when it comes to pricing and setting up projects for success. I think pricing is sort of like ancillary to the success of something. We need to be focused on the success of the service first. And that is that when engaging in a project, result-based pricing is way better than time-based. Okay, because if it's result-based, you can create boundaries in terms of through communication, through engaging in a sales call with a client, through engaging in just dialogue with what their wants and needs are. You can create those boundaries of what their North Star is. And then when you align the price with that, everybody's on board to go towards that journey, to go towards that star. When it's time bound, it's a little bit more difficult. It's actually much more difficult because everybody's worried about, do we have enough time? Are we going to fill up that time? Also, what's really funny about time-based pricing is that you're punished for being efficient and you're penalized for taking too long because everybody stresses, people don't want to spend extra money because it's taking more time than what it anticipated. So I hope that helped you out. That's my mixing rate at the moment. Anyway, until next time, take care.